This afternoon, you're going to hear stories told to you by two of my fellow guides. These stories go beyond the historic events of September 11th that we all know very well and really that touched and changed all of our lives. Instead, their stories will explore the personal costs of that day. So let me introduce you. Michele Davidson is next to me, and next to Michele is Dave Hood. Dave is an attorney. He works for the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. The Port Authority, to simplify it, is the organization that oversaw the construction and management of the first World Trade Center. And their offices were in the North Tower, the first building to be hit. Michele is a native New Yorker, and she has lived in this neighborhood for over 17 years. She is a fashion designer, and she retired in 2006. We're going to begin with Dave first, so I'm going to briefly set the scene for you. The time is 8:46 that morning, and that is when the first plane crashes into the North Tower, the building Dave is in. Dave was in his office at the time on the 68th floor, and the plane enters the building about 25 floors above where he is. All yours, Mr. Dave.
On that day, I was in my office preparing for a 9 o'clock meeting with another colleague by the name of Gene Andracki. I had gone into the bathroom just before American Airlines Flight 11 hit the building. I remember all of a sudden there was a loud sound as if a crane had fallen on top of the building. And the entire building felt like it was going to topple over, but it didn't. And all of the toilets flushed at once. I'll never forget that. And that's kind of, it tainted the way I view going to the bathroom at work ever since that time. But when I got back to my desk, everyone had left the floor, and all of the phones were ringing. One of the phone calls was from the Port Authority Police Department, and the officers informed me that a plane had hit the building. And I remember thinking, boy, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits, so I started to focus on my job. Another phone call was from my boss, who was driving in and could see the building on fire. So when I answered the phone, he said, what are you doing there? The building's on fire. And without missing a beat, I said, plane hit the building. And so I started to focus on my job again. Now, since the alarms hadn't gone off, I thought to myself, well, I'm not in any danger because of my understanding of the Trade Center, and particularly because of my experience from 1993. But just before 9 o'clock, I was about to listen to 1010 Winds, one of the radio stations, and the alarms went off. So I left my desk and got into the stairwell, which was very crowded with people and firefighters. And it must have taken me about close to an hour to get down the 68 flights. And when I got down to the plaza, I was about to get outside, and one of my colleagues stopped me because of the danger of getting crushed from people who were jumping from the upper floors. So I went down to the concourse level. And I remember when I saw all the damage, thinking, boy, this is going to take much longer to repair than 1993. As I was making my way past Zabaros, which was near 5 World Trade Center, all of a sudden I heard someone say, "Take cover." And then it felt like a giant tidal wave or tsunami had suddenly picked me up, and I was flying, and all the walls seemed to be racing towards me. And then all of a sudden, it just went dark. Unbeknownst to me, the South Tower had collapsed. And then I could hear voices. It was surreal. And all of a sudden, I saw lights. And I thought I was dead. Then I heard a voice saying, "If you see the lights, come to the lights." And it was the rescuers looking for survivors. So I got up and I felt my legs, made sure I was okay. I could hear a lady's voice next to me. So I reached out to try to help her. And then I heard, her body felt like she was bleeding or bloody or something, but I heard her say, "Don't touch me, I'm burning up." So I felt really helpless because I couldn't help her. So, but also I felt like I had sand in my eyes, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. So I knew that my life was in danger. I needed to get out. I realized that the walls had collapsed, because where I expected to find an exit to the subway station to get out, it wasn't there. But luckily, I was able to get out with the help of the rescuers. And when I got outside, it looked like a war zone after a bomb blast or something. So I started to make my way to the hospital, which was a couple blocks away. And as I was walking to the hospital, someone saw me and they gave me the handkerchief and said, "You're bleeding." So I put the handkerchief to my forehead. I looked and it was all blood. So I got to the hospital and they flushed my eyes and they checked my forehead and everything. And all of a sudden it went dark in there. And that's because the north tower had collapsed. So I got outside and I started to walk and follow the crowd as they were walking up. And I saw people's expression, so I looked back to see what they were looking at. And then I looked back, I didn't see the towers. Then I realized, it hit me. The towers are gone. And I realized I survived because I was in there. But unfortunately, a number of people didn't survive. My colleague, Jean, she didn't make it, as well as 83 of her employees, her remains, and over 1,100 of the 2,749 people who died that day have never been found. So my three takeaways are: one, to always be grateful to the rescuers for getting me out alive. And two, I realized that as a survivor, I have an obligation to be a voice for Jean and 83 of her colleagues who didn't make it that day. But they were just doing their job, and that's all they were doing and all they were looking for, but they didn't make it. And the third thing is to recognize that love overcomes hate, because despite the hateful act of the terrorists that day, just like that stranger did for me, there are a lot of acts of kindness and love that were shown on that day. Thank you.
You didn't have to be at the Trade Center that morning for it to be just a horrendous experience. Being in the vicinity of the Trade Center was sufficient. And for the roughly 20,000 people who at that time lived down here, it was just a nightmare. Michele is now going to tell you how that day affected her and her family.
Thank you, Judith. September 11th, if you were in New York City, it was a gorgeous day. There was not a cloud in the sky, which is pretty ironic considering what happened. I was in my apartment in New York with my husband, Robbie. We had this apartment, even though we had a house in Jersey, because it made our commute easier. 20 years we were commuting from Jersey, and then we got this little apartment, and it allowed me to go 2 subway stops to work. And my husband, who was the chief architect for the Port Authority, he walked 4 blocks to his job on the 73rd floor in the North Tower. On September 11th, I went to work as usual, 8 a.m. Got to work, and at 8:50, I got a phone call. Now, normally, my husband is at work then, but he was calling me because, as fate would have it, the night before, he watched Monday Night Football. Who would think that that could influence living or dying? Well, he went to sleep very late and decided he was not going to be at his desk at 8 a.m. So he was leaving later. I got the phone call at 8:50. He was telling me he was leaving, but he also said he went to the hall and someone told him the tower was on fire. If you didn't see the towers hit, you didn't know exactly what happened. So I heard him say that. He hung up the phone, figured he's going to work, and I go into my boss's office and I ask him to put on his television, which is in his office. He puts it on, we hear what happened, we're listening. But within minutes, your lives changed and my life changed. I watched the second plane hit the South Tower. We all stood there in shock. But when I finally recovered, there was only one thought on my mind, and that was I had to call my son. My son lived in the area also. He lived 3 blocks away. He had a job where he had to work nights, and he slept during the day, so I knew he was fast asleep. Went from my boss's office into my office, and I proceeded to call him probably 25 times during the next hour, and he did not pick up the phone. A little after 10 o'clock, I received a frantic phone call from my son. He got on the phone and he started screaming, "Oh my God, Daddy's dead, Daddy's dead." I calmed him down. I told him his father went to work late, and then he told me what happened to him. He was fast asleep. His ringer was off his phone. He couldn't get any phone calls. When the first building fell, it actually shook his building. There were hurricane-force winds. There was a small earthquake. He got up. He was jolted out of bed, looked out his window, and saw a cloud rolling towards him. A lot of things go through your head when you see that happening. He ran into the hallway, and his neighbors were there also, and they told him the truth of what was going on. And upon hearing the truth is when he went back into his apartment and he called me. Went into mommy mode, said, "Grab your stuff, and I'm going to call you back in a few minutes, and we're going to meet." Meanwhile, I hadn't heard from my husband for a while, and I really didn't know where he was. But as luck would have it, a short time later, he called me. He also was shaken. Turns out he was standing in the northeast corner of the site when the South Tower fell. He also saw the cloud rolling towards him. He felt the ground shake beneath his feet before the building even fell. He said he just started running north, and he didn't look back. He ended up at a friend's office, kind of midtown, and that's where he was calling me from. I told him he should call Brian, my son, and say, "We're going to meet there, and then we'll all go back to New Jersey." He called Brian, and I walked from my office to where my husband was. And we waited and we waited and we waited for Brian. Brian didn't show. Eventually, we just looked at each other and said, okay. He backpacked around Europe after college, had hardly any money, and managed to get wherever he had to go. So we're just going to have to go on faith that he's going to find his way home. We got ourselves up and started walking down 8th Avenue, which was totally deserted, something you will never, ever, hopefully see again. We walked to Penn Station on 34th Street, where we were hoping eventually trains would run. And eventually trains did run at the end of the day. We got on a train. We didn't even know if it was really going to go to where we had to go, but we knew it was going to New Jersey. The train goes under the Hudson River and comes up on the other side. And I think coming up on the other side and seeing the huge cloud over Manhattan was the first time that day when it all sunk into me. When I do my tours, I always say that that day is about people, and it is. But for that moment, it was about those buildings for me. My husband worked there from 1971 when the first door opened. It was the only job he had. A lot of my life was there. I shopped there, and I felt a part of me was gone. We got home, and of course, Brian was there, and we all hugged, and it was, at the same time, the happiest moment of my life, and probably the saddest day of my life. The next few months, weeks, days, all hard. My husband had to find a place to work. My son had to find a place to live. He lived in a hotel for 4 months. When he finally went back to his apartment, he could not stay there. He was too traumatized, and he did move. The outcome of all of that was I actually did lose a car that was parked in the North Tower in the garage. But I went out and bought a new car. I couldn't go out and buy a new family. I'm still a resident of this area. I'm in a different apartment, 4 blocks north. And when I walk to my corner and I look up and I see what's going on here, all I could say is it makes me smile. Thank you so much for listening.